This is the third in the series of reports from the Central Indiana Masonry Institute scholars, the people who've been awarded the $1,000 traveling scholarships from the Central Indiana Masonry Institute. The other winners of that scholarship are Julie Monk, and before Julie won it, Jim Barrett and Linda Nelson were the winners of the first time the scholarship was offered. Now tonight we'll get to hear a report from Bob Finger. Bob received an associate degree in construction technology from Purdue in the northern part of the state before he came to Ball State. While he was at Purdue, he spent 2 summers on the floor in the steel rolling mill of Bethlehem Steel up in Geary. When he came to Ball State, he turned out to be a finalist in the ICMA competition the year he took it. He was co-designer in 1976 and 1977 of the Muncie Red Cross annual reports. He won the College Award in the AIA-sponsored solar dwelling competition. He spent a year before he came here with Ton and Blank, a fast-tracking firm, and he interned with Fleck and Hickey up north. He utilized this scholarship while he was on Polyarch 4, and it's a real honor for all of us to be able to hear your report tonight. Bob Finger.
Hope it's working. Thank you, Charlie. Okay, thank you for that great list of credits. My purpose for researching concrete block work and presenting it this evening is manifold. Basically, there are 3 things. I hope to pull together into some type of documented format the best concrete block buildings that I discovered in the greater London area. And I firmly believe that you and I are going to see a greater and ever-increasing use of concrete block work in more newer and exciting ways in the future, which are just about to become reality right now. And lastly, as a recipient of this award, through the MICI people, I have to give one, so that's why I'm here tonight. I've got a lot of slides to show tonight, so I guess we can begin right now. We'll turn on the projectors. Okay, the roots of architecture are made of clay, yet the notion of adding one block of stone or a brick upon another and upon another and upon another until a wall is made can be traced back to the ancient walls of Jericho. These clay bricks up here date back 10,000 years. Early builders, even before the Great Pyramids, had relatively little to work with in terms of building materials. They had wood, sun-dried brick, and stone. But by piling stone upon stone, the ancient architects created most of the most imposing structures in history. And few American architects, notably Frank Lloyd Wright and others, have utilized masonry in their designs. Wright opened a whole new vista by pioneering the use of customized block, and he did this through 3-dimensional face patterns that he himself designed. But since the development of the soaring curtain-walled skyscraper, masonry generally had to play a secondary role. The culprit was steel and later reinforced concrete. Lighter, stronger, and faster to erect, they knocked masonry out of the ball game as a load-bearing material for tall buildings. With the new materials, buildings could rise higher and higher, almost without limit. But for masonry to carry the same structural loads, foundations would have had to be so massive as to be unthinkable. Take, for example, the 16-story Monadnock building in Chicago built in 1891. In order to withstand the vertical and lateral loading condition, the dimensions of the masonry walls at the ground level was 6 feet thick. With this kind of technology at hand, turn of the century, a 50-story Monadnock building would have had its first level wall take up the entire first floor. Therefore, it was this type of thinking which led steel to become the leader in structuring tall buildings, and masonry instead lent itself to mainly decoration or unsupported protective sheathing. Nobody even gave it a second chance. In the good old days, or the days before the energy crisis, new buildings were becoming more evident every day when few people, including the so-called design professionals, even thought about fossil fuel extinction. Internally, environmentally controlled buildings was the new wave, and everybody thought it was exciting to see new skyscrapers sheathed in glass. Things were definitely changing, and now in our current decade of energy consciousness and environmental awareness, those changes have come to an abrupt ending. The economy has caused a severe decline in the building program, along with the energy crunch that is forcing us as architects and planners to rethink and reevaluate the more expensive building types and forms and of low energy or energy conscious buildings. London is no exception to the modern day building pattern. During pre-World War II, there were 8 million residents living in the city, and compared to the projected population of only 5.5 million in the year 1991, everybody is moving out. So contrary to popular belief, the smaller scaled and often unnoticed buildings today are the best examples of modern contemporary architecture. This is especially true when directed toward the American culture, where everyone tends to think that bigger is better. Just think of all the large shopping centers, housing complexes, and other large-scale developments. How many can you really consider as honest and good examples of modern contemporary architecture? Often, it is the case of the out-of-the-way, small-scale buildings such as the home, church, or school that teaches us a lesson as to what can be good. And so tonight, many of the examples which I will show, which I will get to shortly, fall in these three categories, which basically are home, church, and school. Becoming involved as an active participant in PolyArc Lab 4 last spring permitted me to study more intensely the British building pattern, particularly that of masonry construction. I feel it is the little buildings made up of concrete blocks and mortar that offer an honest approach to design that I have concentrated my research on. The Greater London area, which is quite large, is such a testing ground. The compact 735 square mile city is like a hodgepodge of architectural styles where many buildings blend harmoniously through the use of brickwork. The British brick is evident throughout the land, where one is reminded of it everywhere you go. But here, the brick is more than just a building component that shelters one from the elements. It is a tradition. And it seems like time and tradition do not fade quite as easily in the British culture as that in the American. Believe it or not, concrete masonry, or blockwork as the British call it, is only a little bit more than 150 years old. Around the turn of the century, the Americans and the British began to develop the concrete block unit as an inexpensive substitute for stone and brick. They started by cementing sand, crushed stone, water, and quicklime, substituting today's Portland cement. And for years, this process continued, although it was very slow and with lack of quality control. But it wasn't until much later that the leading American block manufacturers got together and set quality, size, and performance standards, adopting the 8 by 8 by 12 inch block as the standard, and this quickly changed to the 8 by 8 by 16. So England quickly followed with a similar procedure, but it was tailored to meet the different demands of the country. Architecturally and aesthetically speaking, the concrete block has not been fully exploited in England like it has been part of the general scene for some time in such countries as Finland and the United States. But it is just now becoming widely accepted as a high-quality walling material by the British architects and the builders. So back in England, a country whose architectural profession still considers itself as a legacy of a 19th century gentleman occupation, the concrete block has much more to offer than is generally realized, especially in terms of aesthetics. It is a convenient, versatile, and relatively inexpensive building material in England as well as over here. However, social prejudice has probably more to do with it than anything else for the very fact that it is not used perhaps as it should. The English see it for use in building bridges, garages, and other utilitarian functions in place of the more predominant and aesthetic brick used elsewhere. Applied to the housing industry, concrete blockwork has been almost non-existent until recently. Now, it is increasingly becoming a first choice among the architects. Some of the major attractions are the honesty of the material and the light, shade, and textural effects which can be attained using block in just a fair-face fashion, meaning it's not rendered over or covered over with plaster or stucco or other things. The 3- and 4-story multifamily housing complexes are just now beginning to exploit this old material both for structure and appearance. And if lightweight blocks are used, there will be the added advantage of excellent thermal insulation. Laying the blocks is relatively easy and requires no more specialized skills than bricklaying. Well, almost, that is. Briefly, the choice of concrete blockwork for structural and facing purposes widely varies, ranging in texture from the glassy smooth to the rugged, and in color from white to black with varying degrees of gray in between the two extremes. Also, the standard concrete blockwork shape covers most functional architectural and structural needs. Among the most popular shapes are the solid, solid top, hollow, plain in, offset face, and so on and so on. Technology has permitted the block to be redesigned to solve old problems, such as a slide in the right. The most common problem in blockwork is not so much by the actual process of laying blockwork, but by its finished appearance or the quality of the block laying. Currently, the English building industry is having a slow and difficult time of easing difficulties between the contractors and the architects regarding block laying. British thinking is somewhat difficult to understand at times. The way they see it, a block, even a tiny 8-inch square block, is a heavy object to lift and set in place. Thus, bricklayers commonly employed to lay block do not like laying heavy things neatly. And I quote one of them as saying, "It also goes against the grain for a man to lift excess mortar upward and away with a trowel when he's used to knocking it off downward. The result is that joints tend to vary noticeably in thickness and blocks are laid askew, and the surface gets all covered with mortar." But they require great care in laying because the wall could be easily ruined by the ragged and sloppy mortar joints. So to correct this problem, trained bricklayers are retrained to lay block properly, and the results are impressionable. They have a rigid training period, which is quite surprising to me. In the past, an apprentice would take 5 years to learn his craft, as compared to today. It would just take 3 years for him to complete the mission, but it begins with a 6 weeks training course in a technical college. Remember, the problem with blockwork is that it is hard to lay accurately. Generally, this is the biggest problem with blockwork in England today. It is only to the last few years that block laying is being recognized as a slightly different skill from bricklaying, as I just mentioned. As one contractor so aptly put it, a bricklayer only needs to pick up a brick in one hand and toss it in the air to find the better face and trowel it into place with the second hand. But not so with laying block, for the bricklayer must put the trowel aside and lift even a small block with both hands. And they consider this a bother. Again, it can be considered that blocks, as compared to bricks, don't get no respect, for even the laborers on the construction site do not handle them with the delicacy and reverence of its neighborhood pile of facing bricks. Typically, there can be found too many broken and chipped blocks as a result from the on-site handling. Concrete block is also fairly good at both blocking and absorbing sound. Arresting unwanted noise is attained substantially by easily inserting rigid foam plastic in the block cores or cavity. In the present, as in the past, the vast majority of concrete blockwork is used for internal walling as opposed to fair face, which is only now beginning to see an increase in the external usage of it. Traditionally, a high proportion of the blocks are used for partitions and inner leaves of external walls, which are then rendered or finished with plaster. So throughout most of Great Britain, concrete blocks can be relatively inexpensive and manufactured in three varieties. There are the dense aggregate blocks, which are ideal for very high strengths are required. There's a lightweight aggregate block used extensively in low and medium high-rise housing. And there's, thirdly, aerated concrete blocks. And these blocks themselves rarely travel no more than 50 miles in radius from the place they were made to the place where they were laid. The regional character of the masonry industry means steady progress in its manufacturing process. Today, the concrete block is a versatile source of invention in the construction industry. For about $3,000, and in about a month's time, a form can be designed and made to produce a totally new block. Some block companies, such as in the States here, are constantly changing and perfecting their block designs. One such firm even has a block of the month. The design of a block is not simple, however. Among some of the things that a designer must consider are the compressive strength, the water permeance, the weight, the thermal resistance, and the removal of the block from the form when it is made. But most importantly, masonry's design has to respond to the natural forces, and it has to have a respect in its detailing for the weather. So to put it in a nutshell then, before 1952, the potentials of concrete blockwork had seldom been exploited imaginatively, and when it was, the blockwork was frequently rendered or hidden behind the tastefully British, more traditional type of finish, such as stucco or brick. The block has a lot of competition ahead of him if it is to become a dominant building component. Most British architects and designers treat blockwork as a finished facing material, suggesting little respect in its usage. For example, in a recently published 56-page article written in celebration of the Queen's Silver Jubilee, reviewing 25 years of British architecture from 1952 till 1977, not one page was devoted to concrete blockwork. The following slides then outline what I find to be some of the most important concrete blocks located within the greater London area. The blockwork used in each case varies in the style, the color, composition, and application, and each has its own merits. I believe I have 9 examples up here, case studies of places that I visited, and so I have a lot of slides, but I've cut them down to show just some of the highlights of each. The first example that I looked at, that we're going to see tonight, is some student housing at the University of Surrey, also known as the Battersea College of Technology. It lies on the slope of a rolling mountain overlooking the industrial town of Guildford in Surrey with a population of about 57,000. And incidentally, it is one of the few newer universities in England to be built on an urban site. The architects, Maguire and Murray, which is a very reputable firm in London, spent a considerable amount of time on the initial design stages of the courts. Briefly, they started from scratch and even lived in other various types of student housing conditions until they found one to their liking and then went from there. They came up with 2.5-story buildings evolved in a high-density massing situation to be broken up by a web of loosely linked spaces and small tree-lined courts between. I think the overall siting scheme of the courts is kind of nice, but the corridor effect, so prevalent in most student housing schemes, here seems to disappear. There are no corridors to be found here, no symbols of anxiety and isolation. One of the basic reasons for staggering the buildings is to eliminate the problem of funneling the students through a long hallway. The spaces created by the blockwork massing around it is softened by the careful placing of trees and low-lying shrubs. The number of students per building was also strongly considered, and it was decided that the unit of 10 was significant from a number point of view and from a community point of view. Thus, a small building housing 10 students in 2 shared rooms and 3 pairs of single rooms would still retain one's identity as a group and a place, and yet an individual can relate to it as well. Each unit has its own front door and entrance to give the building a domestic quality to it and create a sense of identity. Diddy Town, as the students call it, is unique in many regards, but like so many student housing complexes elsewhere, it is built primarily of extremely cheap materials, in this case, concrete block and asbestos slate. As you can see, the masonry buildings en masse are designed into a sawtooth-like section, which would allow for natural daylighting to penetrate through the roofs from skylights and into the buildings. Likewise, skylighting would filter into the outdoor spaces between them. So besides letting light enter the rooms, the function of the skylight has another purpose. The room noise escapes through the skylights and into the open space instead of into the courts where it is bounced around and around. These slides here show some of the typical interiors, such as the stairway leading down from a loft on the left, where they have some natural lighting bouncing off the wall, and on the right is a kitchen for 10 people. The blockwork here varies in property to suit different functions. Overall, there were 4 different kinds of blockwork utilized. All the blocks are sized 16 by 8 inches and finished between with slightly raked joints. I really enjoyed visiting this place. The use of blockwork is probably more successful here than anywhere else I've seen, with probably one more exception, which is a church later designed by McGuire and Murray, which I'll show you in a few minutes. The advantages for using masonry as a dorm walling material are many. I don't know why we, such as here at Ball State, have to traditionally cover and hide the block as an exterior element if we want it to look nice. I think there's an obvious lesson to be learned here somewhere. Also located on the campus is a cool gray concrete block sports hall designed by a very large architectural firm of Arup Associates in London. The sports hall rests at the western end of the campus and away from everything else. It is hidden from the town. It rests at the entrance to the university and is separated from the other buildings by another rolling hillside on the opposite extreme of the campus. The sports hall is a simple rectangular concrete block structure with poured-in-place concrete main beams that rest on blockwork piers which stiffen and support the blockwork panels forming the building enclosure. Inside, the yellowish or ryerish brick covering the building on the inside matches the brick used on the main university buildings. The consistent use of yellow brick on all the other university buildings conforms to the standards proposed by the school's consultant architects and the master plan. As you can see inside here, the foyer is bland and looks much like a dormitory lounge. But they did end up using this yellow brick inside the building as opposed to what's outside. The sloping roof lights running parallel with the outer walls illuminate the walls of the central playing space, creating a diffuse pattern of natural daylighting which eliminates the glare on the playing surface. The sports hall is built with a very high quality 9 by 18 inch load-bearing concrete block manufactured exclusively for this particular building. They are about double the scale of ordinary British block and very, very difficult to set in place accurately because of its weight. The block is designed specifically for a non-domestic scale here. After much investigation, the architects, in close collaboration with the block manufacturer, designed a block that would give especially good weathering qualities and to provide a joint which would clearly express the nature of the construction. So for this reason, a block was developed with all 4 front-facing edges chamfered, which you can see there. The look of the chamfered edge casts some interesting and deep shadows, and at the same time, concealing any flaws or tolerances typically found in block-laid buildings in the country. In addition to the special block, a flint aggregate is introduced and is exposed to form narrow vertical striations on the block face. This face is cast with a ribbed surface and wiped off with a wire brush in an up and down motion when it is wet or what they call green. By exposing the aggregate then, which is slightly brown in color, you're actually getting a mixture of cement showing and the brown color at the same time. And this is really good, because what actually occurs then is that the block weathers naturally, and the dirt, you're always going to have dirt, from the cement becomes absorbed in the textured surface of this exposed aggregate. At the same time, the block, due to its rustification, is spreading the dirt around, which is ideal. This action eliminates any streaking that might occur. The primary purpose for the rustification then is to provide not only a small scale texture for the block unit itself, but also a large scale texture for the building itself, so that the 2 scales are simultaneously introduced. At the time of construction, these blocks priced out at just under $9 per square yard of wall surface area, which isn't bad considering you're paying for a custom designed block building. I find the building a success in terms of its function, its siding, and the direct approach to honest expressionism in the materials. The collaboration between the architect and the block manufacturer in Great Britain is a relatively new idea for them. In this instance, I think it worked very well. Okay, from Guildford we move up to Ampleforth College, which is a public, or what they call a Catholic school, for about 800 teenagers, all boys, ages 13 through 18. It's very, very difficult to get up there. It's located way up in the Yorkshire Hill Country, so I didn't actually get up there, but I was able to research it. And there's a specific reason for this, in that they use almost the same block as what you've just seen. The school shares the rugged countryside with an 18th century Benedictine monastery also on the site. A new 2-story classroom wing was added to the old structure, and a new separate building, which is 3 stories high, was built to house students in regular dormitory fashion. Both additions to the campus are built in much the same kind of concrete blockwork as what we just saw in the sports hall. Most of the Victorian Gothic style buildings on the campus are the works of the Gilbert Scotts, and Sir George, from the mid-19th century, designed the main school block and monastery, and it was his grandson, Sir Giles, who a century later designed the abbey, and when finished in the 1950s, was said to be one of the finest examples of Elizabethan to Gothic architecture around. Due to the fact that they are built of stone, as you can see, these older buildings naturally appear very solid and heavy looking. So the new architects seemed it appropriate that they continue this tradition and design the newer additions with a wealth of solid looking materials as well. And I think the effect of blending the old stone with the new block works extremely well here. A sense of weightiness was desired, and which would also be compatible with the old stone in the color, texture, and its scale. But the context is very different between what you just saw in Surrey and here at Ampleforth. The reasons for choosing blockwork over brick and other materials are threefold, says the architects. The external covering of the buildings had to be compatible with the landscape, the existing stone buildings, and what they coined the rugged and bleak weather, which is so dominant up there. The vertically striated blockwork appears to be correct in scale because of its size, and the buff color also complements the original stonework of the surrounding buildings. So when the sun shines, the new blockwork seems to glow a warm golden color. But in contrast here, they are designed to be a little more browner in color than those at Surrey. From the boonies in Ampleforth, we move to the inner city of London. This is the West End, or the theatre district. It's a theatre. The Young Vic Theatre is a temporary theatre. It originally was only meant to last 5 years. So the site, with a 5-year lease assigned to it, had only one small building on it, a butcher's shop, on the ground level, which the architects transformed into a foyer and a flat or an apartment, which then became the theater's offices up above. It was retained due to the $1,000 estimated it would cost to demolish it, so they left it. The theater is aimed deliberately at the young, and it is a sister theater of the Old Vic, which is just located a few blocks away. Today, along with a renewed lease, the Young Vic is no more a temporary theater. It's very successful and popular among the young people. Within the Greater London area, there are virtually no concessions made in standards for construction, nor fire resistance for a temporary building. However, as a temporary building, it would have to be annually inspected and relicensed. So, an uncased steel frame located alongside the building exterior was accepted by the district surveyor, providing these columns are separated from the interior auditorium space by a fire-rated wall and a ceiling. Due to the nature of a temporary building and the traffic and other street noises made outside, the solid blocks were utilized as infill panels and to provide a reasonable degree of sound insulation. The concrete slab roof and floor also provides to some degree acoustic control. Due to the large span structure, only the steel would be sufficient to hold up the roof. Here, the blocks act only as a screen separating the interior from the exterior. Attached to the back of the theater is a new row of concrete blockwork garages, which replaces the old stall holders from the lively street markets with their barrows. There are virtually no interior finishes to be found inside. The reason is because of the cost. Inexpensive clinker blocks are exposed on the interior with no applied paint or finishes, and even the electric conduits exposed on the wall surfaces are there. And even the unfinished floor surface is left unscreeded, unpainted, and naturally uncarpeted. Instead of the usual upholstered seating, one can find simple, red varnished wooden benches that can seat about 400 people. But they end up only being comfortable for about an hour's worth of entertainment. So as you can see, money was spent on nothing but the bare necessities here. I particularly like the exterior corners of the building. Due to the economics of a temporary building and to keep the costs at a minimum, the huge clinker blocks were left uncut at the corners, exposing a huge, unfinished-looking finger joint detail running up the wall. Cutting these huge blocks cost money, so they didn't cut them. But ironically, the degree of quality craftsmanship in laying the blockwork is much, much better on the outside than on the inside, which is what you would seem to be the opposite of what you would expect in a theater. On the interior block wall surfaces, the mortar joints are inconsistent with some rake joints and others are not raked. Clearly, the building looks as if it was built quickly and cheaply as possible. Due to the theater's intimate scale and functional expressionism, it is sympathetic to both the actors and the audience alike. Not only does it function well as a young people's center, but it expresses that cheap materials does not necessarily denote cheapness. Okay, the fifth case study that I saw was a children's reception home, which is a brand new center just under construction when I visited it, for 30 problem teenagers and operated by the borough of Camden. Located right next to it is an also new physically handicapped center designed in the same manner by the same architects, who in this case was a woman. Both these centers blend well in scale with the residential neighbors, although I think it's a queer mix of the traditional and the modern. The brick rail passenger trains glides through the rear of the site on the average of about every 5 minutes. So to combat this problem, the architects cleverly supported the building by a reinforced concrete frame which rests on rubber bearings. And this is to eliminate the vibrations of these passing trains. The proximity to the surrounding new flats was an important design factor. The children of this center are to be kept within the community and near their families. It takes a little bit of ingenuity, though, to locate the entrance, for it is centrally located in the heart of this dense complex of white masonry. That blue gate on the extreme right is one of your entrances, which you have to go through. The two main elements of the building are the children's rooms and the staff quarters. They are linked with a variety of communal activity rooms, and the rooftops of these are used as outside play areas. The reason being they don't have any outdoor ground space to play on, so they put it on top of the roof. The staff accommodations are located on the highest level, and the children's rooms are located on the lowest levels. The resulting spatial interface, which are the courtyards, that occurs between them are designed to catch and reflect the natural light internally and externally off the white blockwork and concrete that seems to be just about everywhere. However, the consistent use of fair-faced blockwork and lightly textured concrete is softened a bunch by the application of low-climbing vines and shrubbery, which the architects designed to considerably humanize the place. And it's going to take a few years. I'd like to go back and take a look at it in about 5 years and see how it's coming along. Also on the inside, various neutral colors were used to soften this harshness, which often accompanies the block walls. I think it's an exciting looking building to look at, but it's a curious looking building because you really can't tell what it is just by simply looking at it. But I think it is nothing more than an excellent example at very poor programming or a lack of a sympathetic design by the architects. I think it simply does not work because the spaces do not work. An overabundance of closed-in corridors are everywhere. There's improper drainage, hidden entrances, unused landscape roof patios or courtyards, and unresolved security and acoustical problems. The lady that ran the center just thought it was atrocious. A whole bunch of as-built changes and additions were required, most notably the numerous outdoor cages between the rooms that were installed to prevent small children from climbing over the walls and falling off the building. So in this regard, I considered it a failure. The kids that live here even refer to it as a prison. Its only saving grace, I think, is the meticulous detailing in the blockwork and the fine job in which it was laid. Okay, now we move on to West Malling. St. Mary's Abbey is located in a beautiful remote corner of a small town, which is about a 1 hour's train ride east of London. The town has a population of just over 2,000 by last count and is quaint, peaceful, and still retains that old world charm that most American tourists unfortunately never familiarize themselves with. Less than a 5-minute walk from the train station sits a centuries-old Benedictine abbey primly nestled away in its own stone walls. The entrance to the abbey is through a 15th century gatehouse and garden, and inside the grounds walls stands a beautifully preserved 13th century cloister arcade, a 14th century guest wing, and an 11th century Norman tower, all part of the original abbey. All of these architectural pieces belong to an enclosed order of Benedictine nuns who live and worship here. It is a contemplative private community dedicated to a discipline of prayer, and it is in this modern church that the nuns come here to pray 7 times a day. The church at St. Mary's is one of the first designed of concrete blocks by the architects of Maguire and Murray, and it uses exterior materials sympathetic to those found in the adjacent abbey buildings, notably the ancient stones of this Norman tower. The church is a spacious, cool-looking building, rectangular in form, and has a simple, white, articulated, well-lit interior. A 3-foot wide lantern roof above allows for plenty of light to filter into the church at all times of the day. Attached to the church is a small, open-ended nuns' choir, all of which is accessible through the simple entrance foyer here on the left. The structural materials for this church are very plain and simple. Concrete blockwork walling and poured-in-place reinforced concrete columns and exposed timber roofing. In this case, it's stained a very soft-looking blue and green color. Concrete block was chosen for many reasons, mainly because it was inexpensive. The choice of the blocks for the walls has proved not only economical, but according to the architects, exactly right in scale, texture, and color. Viewing the block's appearance from outside the building lends one to believe that the slight variation in color gives the church a lively tone, which, in keeping with the centuries-old Kentish ragstone elsewhere. It certainly seems justifiable that amidst its surroundings, the block here in this case certainly belongs here. The block walls are colored a soft gray and laid with slightly recessed joints, which tend to make the wall appear flat. They are painted white, an idea which the architects use again in their church at Northolt a few years later, and we'll get to that in just a second. Not only does it reflect light from above, but it also acts as an effective sound diffuser. These blocks have a very rough texture to them and are used in a fair-face pattern. The blocks that shape the ambulatory form a windowless yet lightweight wall, which in turn supports a tension band of U-shaped reinforced precast concrete units. There are small, semicircular windows used for ventilation. I think they're kind of unique. They are made of frameless plate glass which center on a bronze pivot top and bottom. Very nice detail. One of the best advantages to using ballast block in this case is its color and appearance. I think they do a very fine job of matching up with the Kentish ragstone of its neighboring buildings, and I think this church represents a highly accomplished and sensitive use of concrete block. Okay, this church, also by Maguire and Murray, was the very first project I visited. It's called the St. Joseph of the Worker. That isn't exactly the church, that's the pub just located right down the street. But these architects have consistently chosen concrete blockwork in their designs of churches and schools. 22 years ago, the firm first became familiar with the material, which is usually thought of as nasty, rough stuff. And they began to look at the blockwork in a more highly sophisticated context. In St. Joseph's, they exercise great control where the bonding and the scale are concerned. This is the church. The town of Northolt is an industrial town. Most of the people that live there work at Heathrow Airport or in some of the surrounding factories nearby. The image of a factory is surely here in the church, but I think it's the cleanliness and intimate scale within that breaks up this image. in the open plan concept church. One of the primary reasons why the church gets its industrial character is through its large, non-articulated skylights, which light up the interior brilliantly. It is thought, by varying the degree of brilliance, the architects conceived the space as what they called a container of light. McGuire and Murray chose concrete block for the church simply because they liked it in terms of their former experience, especially what we just saw at St. Mary's Abbey in the previous example. Thus, block won out over brick in this regard, though brick was seriously considered earlier in the design stages. The smaller scaled brick would have worked nicely in this residential community, but overall gray block was finally selected because it weathered well and it matched the respective gray colors throughout the building's appearance. Most noticeably is the gray zinc cladding, which make up the majority of its exterior. The building structural system is quite simple, consisting of paired 6-inch tubular steel posts painted white, and the outer posts carrying the walls and the inner posts rising to take the ends of the 4 main roof beams spanning the centralized space. The concrete blocks comprising the lower half of St. Joseph's Church are faced with natural gray, high-density hollow block, and was chosen as to not interfere with the colors in the surrounding neighborhood. Also, gray would blend harmoniously with the gray zinc cladding visible on the upper walls and roof of the church. Cavity wall construction makes up all of the walls in the building, beginning with 16-inch fair face both sides in the church and 10-inch fair face both sides in the meeting hall, where it is left unpainted. This, incidentally, is the entrance to the church. All the partitions were left fair-faced and are of solite, which is a brand name, a lightweight aggregate block of semi-rough texture. It is painted white throughout to reflect the light. Plain, simple, and clean detailing are consistently used within the building, relying on good quality workmanship for effect. Thus, the use of simple, self-finished material components has greatly contributed to an overall low-cost building. One of the dominant features of the site is the detached bell tower, also of blockwork, which stands 43 feet high, 12 feet round. The tower is pulled away from the church and nestled close to Yeating Lane, which is the main thoroughfare, and it acts as a homing target or a landmark for the neighborhood. Some of the observations I made visiting the site seem to have some subtle but maybe important meanings to them. For instance, graffiti occurred everywhere in many regards and in several entrances to the building, especially to the entrance to the meeting room, which is here on the left. It seems as though the neighboring school children reacted several times over in an aggressive behavior according to the wall writings, most of which were drawn onto the blockwork. So it seems like the fair-faced blockwork is a surrogate blackboard to some of the kids, and maybe because it is a church, there are no dirty words to be found. I looked all over. Finally, the key element to remember this church building by is through the well-designed and carefully chosen use of the material that serves the purpose of both structure and finish at the same time. The problem often associated with blockwork don't seem to bother the architects here. They first anticipate the problem, work it out on paper, and then decide to build. This is a convent of the Sacred Heart of Mary. There really isn't too much to comment on this particular building. It's a very small building. I only mention it here due to, well, I don't know whether to call it block or bricks. I'll leave it up to you to decide. The convent is oddly situated on a very busy thoroughfare, and one is surprised to come across it upon its arrival. It's a shame that it does not mix well in appearance and form with its older and more charming neighborhood residences across the way. City ordinance ordinances suggested only that a brick material must be used for construction. The architects seemed to digress a little bit and move away into a little bit slightly larger sized block and attempted to experiment here. They did try to, however, break down the scale of the block into a smaller scaled component. It measures 7.5 by 3.5 by 3.5 inches, and it has a very warm glow to it, and the sisters who live here seem to like it. I think it's an interesting exercise. My last example here is in Wimbledon, where the house, designed by Arup again, is an interesting and architecturally exciting home, nestled amidst its more traditional forms of British housing. I find it somewhat ironic that this concrete and concrete block house is generally accepted as a luxury home, while these materials, when used in the same context, are generally reserved for housing the masses. The home, which is now 10 years old, is in a quiet residential area surrounded by the backs of 2 gardens of adjacent homes. The site is very narrow, only 110 feet by 48 feet, with a 10-foot slope running across it, and silver birch trees were everywhere. Therefore, the disposition of the trees and the sloping of the ground dictated the layout of the house. The home, or as the neighbors call it, the fort, shines with a very high degree of quality detailing and stands out above its surroundings due to its rectilinear form and its overall white color. The house was laid out in a very orderly fashion. These slides help to show the character of each main building component: concrete block, wood, and glass. Each is clearly expressed. The block work is laid in fine, consistent uniformity and quality and defines the spaces within and around the building. The wood elements, such as the doors and the flooring, and the glass, which is butted directly against the block, are both clearly separated from the masonry and detailed in a very nice way to stand out on their own. The owners, both are from South Africa, and they're lovers of natural light and the outdoors. So naturally, they wanted a house which would visually bring the outdoors into the house and at the same time create an extension of the indoors out into the green gardens. This mixture of gardens and interior, especially the living room, really makes this house seem larger than it really is. It was decided early in the programming stages that a house as maintenance-free as possible would be a strong design character. Leaving the fair-faced blocks unfinished on the interior surfaces prompted zero maintenance for the residents living there, whose only upkeep on the building was painting the living room ceiling. It is interesting how the blockwork has been employed, because it is done so well and with such elegance that it would seem to justify its continued usage in more homes today. Therefore, in conclusion, I think there will be a tremendous upsurge in the use of blockwork, especially in housing, not only in Great Britain, but in America as well. The extensive use of blockwork in its own right has probably been the greatest change which has taken place in this century in the construction industry. And end to end and row upon row, masonry has a logic so simple about it that even a child could use it. Thank you.